Thank you so much, Mary, for such a warm introduction. It was just beautiful. And congratulations to Hester. The work that Hester does, particularly in highlighting the gender issue around superannuation and retirement saving, is just so important in this nation. So Mary, thank you very much for your beautiful introduction and for the work that you do every day. I also want to thank CEDA. CEDA have been a fabulous partner, so thank you, Michael, in changing the status quo here in Australia around gender equality. When several years ago they came and asked me what I thought they could do, it was just a great partnership which has really put this issue on the national agenda. So thank you so very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I acknowledge that we're meeting on traditional lands, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. As I step down as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner, I've been reflecting on the remarkable journey and the privilege it's been to serve in this role for the last 8 years. And like me, some of you may have come to a time in your lives, either professionally or personally, where you go through a transition, where you look back and you reflect on the path you've taken. I love everything about this role. It's absolutely been my dream job. But what I enjoy most, beyond the politics, even beyond the policy, but don't tell CEDA that, beyond the policy, the politics, the legislation, the statistics, are the incredible individuals that I've met along the way. So today, I hope I don't disappoint you, but I'm not going to talk about the law or the policy solutions or even the human rights conventions. Rather, I want to talk to you about what I've learnt in accelerating change, in accelerating reform. And at the heart of my message today is the importance of stories. Human stories have the ability to sharpen and guide, so stories is where we'll begin. Over the last 8 years, I've met women and men from Launceston to Arnhem Land, from Canberra to the Kimberley. This role, as many of you know, has taken me from 200 metres under the ocean in a submarine to camping out with Aboriginal women in the Kimberley, from the slaughterhouses of production lines in South Australia to the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. It's taken me to remote communities, to company boardrooms, small but powerhouse community organisations, government agencies, unions, the Parliament, the decks of frigates, the Pentagon, NATO, the United Nations, the World Bank, and everywhere in between. So I have to say there's not many roles like this one. But in every environment, I've had choices. Picture this. I'm standing and dining. Actually, I'm dining in a Northern Territory pub when the men at the neighbouring table send over an expensive bottle of bubbly together with a very encouraging wave. Now, we don't want to disappoint them, but my 3 colleagues and I are hardly the easiest romantic targets. 2 lesbians, 1 recently engaged woman, and the Sex Discrimination Commissioner. Now, that's a tall order even by Northern Territory standards. I'm still working out whether I'm going to tell that story up in the Northern Territory. But the stories that I've heard as I've travelled echo the feminist adage, and that is that the personal is political, that personal injustices often demand political solutions. This catch cry, of course, was intended to rewrite the rules, to bring the private sphere, which was a sphere inhabited by women, into the public domain. In short, the personal still matters, the lived experience of inequality, of exclusion, of hardship. Not only does the personal matter, it is precisely the spark that will it's precisely the thing that will ultimately spark change. It's the stories that will enable us to take that next step forward. So today, that's what I want to do. I want to share some of the stories. I want to share with you some of the lessons that I've learnt. And I want to talk to you about the great optimism that I have for our ability to shape a more gender equal future. Many of the stories have been missing from our national consciousness, from our public debates. Yet they're the stories that demand our consideration, our empathy, our best and most practical response to human lived experience. These stories teach us about the importance of learning through listening, of standing in each other's shoes, of understanding that decisions that are made or not by those in power have an impact on individual lives, of the power of words, the need to rewrite the rules when they perpetuate injustice, and most importantly, the need to reimagine normal. They also remind us that gender equality matters. It matters to girls and boys, men and women, young and old, business, unions, government, and the community. It matters to me, it matters to you. Gender equality goes to the very heart of who we are and how we live. Stand in Lurlene's shoes for a minute. I'm in Hobart. Lurlene's running a young women's refuge there. Every day, Lurlene makes sure that girls escaping violence, substance abuse are given a warm bed, have food, have a chance at an uninterrupted education. And on the morning I roll up to see Lurlene, she's already been up at 2 a.m. to resolve a dispute between one of the residents and her boyfriend. And then again at 3:30 a.m. when that boyfriend comes back to burn the refuge down. And then finally at 6 a.m. to get those girls off to school. But like so many in the sector, as Mary just said, so many in the sector, Lurlene's role is unrelenting. She's 72 years old and she should have the option of retiring from paid work. But for her, the price of a lifetime spent working in care is to be consigned to poverty in later life. Lurlene's story prompts me to ask, is poverty to be the reward for a lifetime spent caring? Is that what we're really saying? She also reminded me that when we see injustice, we need to rewrite the rules. Now, see Maria. I'm in Western Australia now. Maria's working hard in the construction industry. Many of us might take for granted the ability to have a career and also a family in the 21st century. But when Maria announces her pregnancy, her manager's response is most definitely not from the 21st century, it's back in the 19th century. His response, indeed this was a female manager, her response was, "Your choice, Maria, the job or the baby." Now, Maria's story teaches us that decisions that are made by those in power have an impact on individual lives, that work and care should not sit at opposite ends of one hard choice. And picture Jane. I'm in Queensland, a young woman in our armed forces who excels in her training course with distinction, just the kind of women we need in our military. So why is it that she's subjected to extreme bullying and exclusion? No one speaking to her on exercise for weeks on end, alone for meals in their military mess while her colleagues banter at the next table, turned backs. Jane's participation in Australia's military comes at immense personal cost, but she finds the courage to speak out, and in so doing, she reminds us that words can be powerful beyond belief. And finally, imagine this. I'm in my office in Pitt Street, the phone's ringing. It's Margot, a woman who attended a lunch that I spoke at the day before. She's a senior manager in one of the major banks, and she's got more than 200 staff. But she still remembers. She remembers her own story of growing up in a violent household, of wiping the blood from her mother's face, of taking her to the hospital, of the shame and the silence that surrounds family violence. A child wanting escape, but seeing no options. Margot's story reminds me, as one young woman living with domestic violence recently told me, she said, freedom is something you can think about, talk about, write about. But if you have not experienced freedom, you cannot feel her essence. So these are the stories that, when viewed as personal histories, can be seen as deeply dispiriting, deeply sad. Yet 8 years on, I can confirm to you that they're not just done deeds. They are the voices that speak of Australians striving to create a better future. How far have we come in listening, in really listening to these voices? And as I travelled around, I've also heard much from men, because I've made it my business to engage deeply with men. I've heard about the pressure they experience to conform to gender norms, The gender norms just don't constrain women, but also men, and the barriers that men face when trying to dismantle them. And I also hear about how men are impacted by the inequality that still exists for women. Gender equality is not a battle of the sexes. It's a battle for equality, a battle that men and women must wage side by side. So where are we at today? Well, when I first came into my role, I realised pretty quickly that I'd need to really set up a strategic approach. I couldn't be reactive. I worked out on day one that I could spend my entire life as Sex Discrimination Commissioner just commenting on the difficult, inopportune gender comments made, often in our parliaments around Australia, I have to say, or elsewhere. The fact is, every issue has a gender perspective. So it was really important to set a proactive program of work. And so I set out across the country on my listening tour, which was one of the great joys of the work that I've done. In the same spirit of inquiry that informs your decision-making, I combined an analysis of the hard data with the findings from my listening tour. And this enabled me to set a gender equality blueprint in 2008, which, as Mary said, covered 5 areas. But it would be the guide that would really steer my work over my 8-year term. And that was about a paid parental leave scheme for Australia, together with the issues around work and care, ensuring women's lifetime economic independence, women in leadership, preventing violence and sexual harassment, and also making sure we had the strongest laws here in Australia. So 8 years later, as I review progress against the blueprint, so much has changed. Australia now has a national paid parental leave scheme. We also have a period of leave for dads and supporting partners. We have the right to request flexible work arrangements under the industrial relations legislation. The number of women at leadership level is increasing, and particularly more than doubling on our company boards. We have one of the strongest repositories of data through the WGEA from which to guide evidence-based policy. We're one of 3 countries only which now has strong data around pregnancy discrimination and sexual harassment. We have a much stronger Sex Discrimination Act. And we have disruptive initiatives like the Male Champions of Change. And it's great to have one of our male champions, John Lydon, with me here today. Not only that, I think the case is that leaders across Australia recognise that high performance is dependent on achieving a strong level of gender diversity in organisations. And most importantly, business and organisations now know that violence against women is also a workplace issue. But the individual stories and the bigger picture alike both tell us that there's so much work still to be done. We must turn our attention to the fact that 1 in 4 women has been sexually harassed in our workplaces in the last 5 years. 2 women a week are being murdered by their intimate partner as a result of domestic and family violence. And what we know now is there are more women living with intimate partner violence in the world than there are malnourished people. That's 980 million, almost a billion. We know that there's continued underrepresentation of women in leadership positions, and that's in every sector. Just to give you this stat, fewer big Australian companies are run by women than by men named Peter. And if you look at it even further, indeed, companies run by a Peter, a Michael, a David or an Andrew outnumber those run by women by 4 to 1. The majority of unpaid caring work, whether that's caring for family, caring for older people, that's still done by women. Indeed, 70% of that work is. And not only that, the gender pay gap currently stands at, and this is new research which the ANZ did the other day, that over a typical career, over a lifetime, a woman will earn $700,000 less than her male colleague. That's enough to buy an average Australian home, although probably not in Sydney. It shouldn't surprise us, therefore, that women have just over half the retirement savings, as Mary said. Now, my view is everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. The picture I've just painted of continuing inequality is not the ravings of a feminist left, but rather the hard facts as described by reputable bodies such as the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Because solving for gender diversity is a challenge that yields to all the same management disciplines employed in the business world to achieve goals. Individuals who make progress have a visible commitment to change. That's the starting point. They set targets to crystallise intent. They ensure that addressing gender diversity is part of a business strategy. They invest energy and capital through planned intervention. They learn about what interventions work and which ones don't. They course correct, and then they start the cycle all over again. They don't lose sight of the goal. They achieve. So it's very much about leadership. Gender diversity achievers are gender diversity leaders. Such leaders make a decision to step up and lead on this issue. And they don't give up when it's hard, just as the CEO who commits to the board to increase customer service quality doesn't then front up at the board meeting the next week and say, look, you know what, I tried a few things. Trouble is our customers don't seem to like us as much as I thought they would, so maybe we could go back to focusing on costs. But that's what I see every day in this area. And what I do know is that if we are to make progress, we must continue with the process of change. So let me just give you a few thoughts from the last 8 years about what I think can create change. And I hope that by giving you my learnings and adding them to your learnings, surely we can find a way to accelerate reform where the outcome is a greater use of both our talents. So number one, having influence. What I've really understood is you don't have to be extraordinary to have influence. I mean, I'm certainly not. I'm a great example of that. One woman in the United Nations recently told me when I asked her about change, she said she did what she could when she could. That's how she changed the world. And I think that simple concept gives us such confidence and energy. Do what you can when you can. It's a beacon of hope. It's a constant friend against all the complexities, trials, frustrations, and morale-sapping slowness of trying to make a difference. So do what you can, when you can. That's how you'll change the world. 2, collaboration. You don't have to change the world alone, and I realised that very early on when I came into my role, that if I was going to help to advocate for a new paid parental leave scheme, I'd need to reach out. So I picked up the phone and I rang Sharon Burrow, the head of the union movement, and I rang Heather Ridout, head of the AIG. And we found common ground. Indeed, our joint opinion piece published shortly thereafter started with these words. It's not often that the Australian Industry Group, the ACTU and the Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner agree, but we all support a national government-funded scheme of paid maternity leave. So strong partnerships have been absolutely key to making progress throughout my years. And collaboration always brings insights that's often a prerequisite to developing wisdom. The fact is, when you stake out common ground with others, that's when you create a strong foundation for future reform. Third thing I learnt was around intersectional discrimination. Not all women start from the same position. We're not a homogenous group, just like men aren't. Therefore, we must be wary of averages, of presenting a uniform picture, or of proposing a one-size-fits-all solution. The fact is that certain groups of women represent the minority of the minority, and inequality will affect those who have less power to a much greater degree. Take violence against women with disability, for example. You may know that in New South Wales last year, a man shot his 3 children and then his wife before taking his own life. The media reported, oh, there are 5 victims. No, there are 4 victims and 1 murderer. And as the late Stella Young wrote, she said, when we hear that a murdered wife is also a woman with a disability, we can find ourselves a little bit less horrified, as though her status as a disabled woman gives us a little more empathy towards the perpetrator of a violence. It really is victim blaming at its worst. The 4th thing I've learnt is actively and intentionally include. The fact is, if we don't actively and intentionally include women, the system will unintentionally exclude them. So pouring in a few women and stirring is never going to be the solution. The fact is, we need some form of systemic intervention, and the reason for that is nearly every organisation in this nation is deeply rooted in a male way of being. That's the history of the organisation. So we need to change the systems, the structures, if men and women to thrive equally. And that's why targets matter. It doesn't matter so much what the target is, it's the act of setting a target and making it public. That's what's important. Targets and merit are not mutually exclusive. In fact, targets are necessary to allow women's merit to be revealed. And number 5, the data by itself is never enough. To create change, you have to take the case for change from people's heads to their hearts, with individual stories the spark that fuels a commitment to take action. This means you have to operate on a couple of levels. On one, you must pursue systemic change, reforming the broken systems of which you find yourself a part. On the other, you have to value acts which correct injustice, which make another person's day a bit more kind, more just, more dignified. It's right and necessary to hold your compassionate self with your strategic self. You can't be overwhelmed by the sadness, the powerlessness you might feel on hearing the stories. And I know that very strongly personally. Some days I just think, whoa, there's so much pain. But on those days I say no. When you're moved by what you hear, what you witness, you have to use that deep emotion to start to affect change. For example, part of my work has been driving the Male Champions of Change strategy. It's a strategy where men step up beside women to move forward on gender equality. And for many years, we've really focused solely on women's leadership in organisations. But this year, the men decided they wanted to know more about violence against women and domestic violence. So we decided to start by bringing in 2 courageous survivors of domestic violence, Rosie Batty and Christy McKellar, 2 exceptional women. And the men heard about the pieces that are taken from you that can never be reclaimed, like the joy of seeing your son grow up. They began to understand that domestic violence is a serious workplace issue. They heard about struggling to hold down a job while living with domestic violence. I mean, for Christy, who was a senior manager running a big team, it was about hiding the bruises, finding that her husband had sawn the heels off her shoes, so it was so difficult to get to work, taking the car keys, hiding the mobile phone. Since then, what we've seen is the Male Champions of Change really step up on domestic violence, and I'm really excited about some of the new initiatives that they'll be announcing. But perhaps the most crucial lesson I've learnt, and this is lesson 6, engaging power. The most crucial lesson I've learnt is to identify where power resides and then to take the personal directly to its heart. For example, in 2011, I led the review into the treatment of women in Australia's Defence Force. And I have to say, undertaking that role has been one of the great privileges of the work that I've done, working so deeply connected with our Australia's military. But as I travelled around Australia, I heard incredible stories, and I have to say most of them were very positive. But on occasion, I heard deeply distressing stories, stories that had never been told before. And that's when I started to understand it was important that I heard the stories because they would be included in my reports tabled in the Parliament. What was more important was that the men who had power to create change in the system heard those stories. So what did we do? We arranged for the senior chiefs, the Chief of Army, Air Force, Navy, the senior people in the military, to actually stand in the shoes of women who loved the military as much as they did, but for whom service had come at an unacceptable personal cost. To really understand what extreme exclusion feels like, what it's like to be on exercise for 4 months when no one speaks to you, what it's like to have sexually explicit images of you circulated around the base, what it's like to be ostracised because you had the courage to speak out. And I'll never ever forget the first face-to-face session. The service chief sitting uncomfortably in his chair, the mother nervously escorting her daughter into the room, I'm sitting here, and the box of tissues in the middle. But how to kick this conversation off? And it was that courageous young woman, she turned to the chief and she said, "Sir, I am so nervous." And he looked at her and he said, "You know what? Believe me, I'm scared too." And in that moment, I knew we had a chance at change, because it takes a courageous young woman and an authentic and compassionate military leader to admit that he fears what he's about to be told. So what these sessions have taught me is that inclusion is not something that can be applied from outside. Inclusion must grow from within. And when we prompt an insider to hear and feel exclusion's unwelcome consequence, we start to plant the seeds of inclusion. Lesson 7 was the importance of women's voices. Women's voices must elevate. As Lima Galbi, who you may know, she's a Liberian peace activist, a winner of a Nobel Peace Prize, she says, there can be no legitimate conversation without the voices of women. Or as Rosie Batty told the men, she said, "Look, prior to Luke's death, no one wanted to hear my story of living with violence. Now everybody does." And I have to say that was a sad day for me in the role, because it indicated to me that when women living with violence speak, the system doesn't listen. So one of the most important contributions we can all make is to give voice to those who have been silenced, to tell the individual stories that make the broader issue mean something more than just the data. Second last, learning is about persistence. The fact is, not all progress has a watershed moment like the one I described to you in the military. Most progress comes on the back of many small intentional steps. And shaping a more gender equal world is a journey characterised by persistence. It's a long and often winding road. I've realised that to have influence, to create momentum, I have to have a strong belief in myself, both finding and maintaining courage. It is as vital for women to be powerful and influential as it is for men. And finally, my lesson is that we see the world as we are rather than as it is. We must ignore the barbs and personal attacks, because assaults like these stem from a fear of change. Respond to every person and every opinion with patience. Navigate hostile situations with compassion. Too many experts roll up to organisations and want to change things before understanding the investment each individual has in what is there already. It's as true for you as it is for me to seek to understand each individual's contribution to the existing structures and systems before we start to try and change them. Because after all, each of us sees the world as we are rather than as it is. We bring our own beliefs and experiences. It's like we show up to each new situation with a backpack of everything we've ever learned. And we can't let our learnings and previous experience constrain us. Don't be limited by your own experience. When it comes to gender equality, like anything else worth doing, think big, think creatively, and rewrite the rules. So I began with the stories, and I continued with my learnings, which I hope will give you some food for thought. But I don't want to leave you hanging without me imparting to you my deep sense of optimism for our continued work. The stories, as I've told them, are incomplete. They lack a continuation. They lack a what happened next moment. I call this continuation rewriting the rules. Rewriting the rules can apply at a systemic level and an individual level. In fact, the individuals whose stories I shared with you have all rewritten the rules. Lurleen, for example, she may not be in possession of a solution for her own economic woes, having spent a lifetime caring, but she continues to teach young women about the importance of economic independence, that a man is not a financial plan, that it is as important for women to have economic strength as it is for men. Maria, well, she's involved, and she has been involved in the development of a suite of tools for pregnant women, which we launched just last week with the unions, the employers, and all the government agencies. So we now know that every pregnant woman in this nation has access to comprehensive information about the period over pregnancy and parental leave. And not only that, that every employer will have information about their obligations. Jane, she's now the face of a women's recruitment campaign for the Defence Force. Her unit is now a model for inclusion, and the programs developed there are being rolled out across her service. She's currently serving for us in Afghanistan, where she's engaging with Afghan civil society about their empowerment of women. And she texted me just recently, she said, "It brings a smile to my face thinking of the ongoing impact of deciding to share my story." And what about Margot? Well, the day of that call, when Margot called me in my office in Pitt Street, Margot found the courage to speak of her own experience. She said to me, "Liz, today I called all my staff together, and instead of our regular town hall, we spoke about domestic and family violence, the prevalence data, the silence, the shame. I began by telling them my own story, a story I'd never told before. And I finished by saying to all my staff, I want you to do one thing. I want you to tell everyone in our bank my story, because in so doing, I hope I give licence to others to tell theirs." That day, Margot found her voice. She recognised that out of tragedy comes immense power, and her bank is now one of the leading banks in our nation in its response to domestic violence. So these women all rewrote the rules, and in the process, they began to understand that their words were powerful beyond measure. I fervently wish that their experiences had not been theirs, but I'm immensely grateful that they found the courage to share them with others. Gender equality is the unfinished business of the 21st century. Every week I hear examples of how the system's failed women, either individually or collectively, but it is those imperfections that teach us to make better decisions. I remind myself it is those imperfections that allow us to right the wrongs of a path and to work for a better future. And as Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the previous Secretary General of the UN, once said, he said, "The future is the horizon, but it's also the first step we take tomorrow." Like the pioneers of a women's movement, the women whose stories I've shared with you today, they've taken the first steps. They're doing what they can, when they can. That's how they're changing the world. This means we have cause for hope, because there will always be women and men of courage, because there will always be stories that engage both the head and the heart, stories that remind us that the personal is still and always will be political. As Commissioner, I've had a wide-ranging responsibility to speak when I see unfairness, to disrupt the status quo, to create opportunities for other women, to raise my son and daughter to believe that equality is the only path. This is an ongoing responsibility for all of us, not one that I'm going to set aside simply because I depart the role. But just as for you, whatever comes next for me must have meaning. And as John Gardner, who was a secretary in the 1960s, actually, in the US Department of Health, Education and Welfare, he was a man who set one of the most ambitious policy agendas in America's history, perhaps a male champion of change in today's language. As he once said, he said, "Meaning is not something you stumble across, like the answer to a riddle or the prize in a treasure hunt. Meaning is something you build into your life. You build it out of your own past, out of your affections and loyalties, out of experience of humankind as it's passed on to you, out of your own talent and understanding, the things you believe in, the values for which you're willing to sacrifice something. The ingredients are there. You are the only one who can put them together into that unique pattern that will be your life. So a life without advocating for change is not a life that will have meaning for me. So how will I continue? Well, I'll continue to use my voice to create an Australia that welcomes women, an Australia that cherishes their voice and eagerly awaits their wisdom. I'll use my influence to create a world where a woman's value does not decrease because of another's inability to see her worth. A world where vulnerability transitions into power, where difference is celebrated, where leadership is shared, and where each half of humanity embraces and respects the other. How will you use your voice? Thank you.